Hello, everyone. How are you? And welcome back. I hope you're able to stretch your legs and are looking forward to our next session. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Diana Young. She's a final year psychology student in the Dublin Business School and is the current NStEP student trainer, as well as a member of the National Student Associate Assembly. Diana has been a public face for the Student Listening Service Nightline, the past Vice President for Education at DBS Students' Union, head girl, peer mentor, and a class rep. And having grown up in three different countries, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Ireland, and receiving her education in various settings, Diana's experience are what fueled her in her goal in striving to be an advocate for all students, no matter their background, as well as their teachers and institutions. So Diana believes that the student contribution through student representation, whether on a peer-to-peer level, an institutional level, a national and international level, is vital to the academic experience. So I'm going to hand you over to Diana for this next session.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be with you all here today. I trust that you all had a really good mini break in anticipation for our final segment of today. I firstly want to thank you for, pun intended, engaging in today, and as such, in such an important aspect of the greater higher education process, that of which is student engagement. Now, arguably, just as instrumental student engagement is to higher education, so is student representation. And it's been evident even throughout today that without one, we can't really have the other. So this session is going to be all about enhancing student representation. And we're going to be hearing from two unique perspectives today regarding this topic. First, we have Emer Neville's perspective on how the Irish Second Level Students' Union has strengthened student representation at the second level and subsequently in the tertiary level during the pandemic. Following this, Dr. Phil Carey will challenge us to think differently about how we perceive class reps and to ensure that we fully value their role and their contributions. I believe afterwards we'll have some allocated time for questions and comments on both topics and both speaker notes. In the meantime, however, I do encourage that you all feel free to message in the chat and share what's on your mind throughout the sessions. So now we have Emer Neville. Emer Neville is an 18-year-old gap year student from Tipperary and is the president of the Irish Second Level Students Union, short for ISSU. The ISSU is an international representative body for the second level students in the Republic of Ireland and is led by students for students and works to represent, uplift, and defend student voices by providing support to individual student councils and simultaneously engaging with education stakeholders and developing new policies on issues that affect second level students. Now, the ISSU will aim to provide a collective voice for second level students while working to continually develop a transparent, fair, and modern education system, which I think is really important given that, we're working towards the tertiary level education system, but it's also important to kind of shine some light on the second level system also. Now, with the theme of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on student engagement, which I'm sure you will definitely find interesting, I'm going to now direct you over to Emer.
Hi everyone, I'm Emer and I'm just going to share my screen there. So I've put together just a short presentation just to kind of, I suppose, discuss the COVID-19 impact on student engagement. So just one second there. Can you guys see that okay? Perfect. So I suppose just to start off with a bit about the ISSU. I know that most of the people here are probably more engaged with the third level sector. So founded in 2008, the ISSU is the national representative body for school students in the Republic of Ireland. And that's secondary school students as well. So we aim to foster a stronger student voice at all levels of the education system. And to do this, we work primarily with second level, but we do also engage with the USI on various third level topics, such as funding higher education and things like that. So we believe that school students should be involved in all matters that directly affect them. And this means having a seat at the decision-making table and being respected as an equal stakeholder. So this would be primarily one of the key areas of our work is fighting to have students at those tables, in those meetings with ministers and other relevant education stakeholders. But most importantly, the ISSU is led by students for students. So we have an executive team nationally. They're made up of 12 officers. That's what I would sit on. And then we also have a regional team of, I think it's 44 officers from all around the country. So we're an entirely student-led organisation, which is really important and crucial in the work that we do. So I suppose the first question is, what is engagement? And Roisin and Rhiannon, they both answered that question quite well in their own presentations as well. So here is just a quick a piece from the Cambridge Dictionary. So there's kind of two different definitions. So the fact of being involved with something and the process of encouraging people to be interested in the work of an organisation. So I suppose those are the two aspects of engagement that students' unions and the student movement would primarily work with. So getting students involved with the movement, but also trying to encourage students to be interested in the work that the students' union does, as well as trying to encourage other stakeholders, such as, we'll say at second level, the Minister for Education, but also at third level with staff members in the third level institutions as well. So with COVID-19, we've seen quite a lot of positives actually come out of the pandemic in terms of student engagement. COVID-19 highlighted the importance of student engagement and student voice from a second level perspective. So this year, over the last 3 years, really, we've seen what we would consider just a massive uptake in the student engagement, and students actually being more interested now than ever in the work that's going on, and getting students involved in these different committees and organizations, but also involving themselves in the work that the unions are doing. You would have seen over the last few years as well that exam students mobilized in a structured way to amplify their voices and ultimately assert their right to have a seat at the table. So particularly with the discussions around the Leaving Cert and the Junior Cert, you would have seen exam students come together to really fight to have their voices. Ciara Fanning, she would have been president of the ISSU in 2020. She worked with students around the country as well as the ISSU to assert students' right to have a seat on the advisory group for state examinations planning, and successfully did so. And that's just one of the many positives that came out of that, with students being included in that discussion. People listened to students. I suppose that's another positive, and for the most part we were listened to by the department. We saw successfully 2 Leaving Certs were cancelled, and then again this year we saw further choice being added to the Leaving Cert, and that's all just because of student participation, student engagement in the student movement and with the student unions as well. Students again around the country just mobilised to really assert their voices in this situation. The recognition of students as stakeholders in their own education. Students are now solidified in the education system. This year as well, we saw students appointed to the National Council for Curriculum Assessment, which is one of the most crucial bodies in the education sector. They write curriculum, they inform students of essentially what they're going to be studying, and also write key policy documents and things like that. And students are now not just being consulted, but they have a seat at the table. And this is one of just the many positives that have come out of this. As a former ISSU president, Ciara Fanning put it, students are no longer pawns in their education, they are partners. And this is really, really an important move that I'm not necessarily sure would have happened without the COVID-19 pandemic. But with all the positives are also negatives. This year in particular, student engagement has actually taken a drastic hit. And we saw less students engaged with their unions, particularly at third level, but it's also something that we've seen at second level. Students' unions at second and third level saw a very high number of uncontested races within their students' unions, and also an incredibly low voter turnout. I know in our own elections, and we held them very recently, I think it was 4 or 5 uncontested races, which, you know, when you're trying to elect the body of an organisation, and also trying to engage students in that and to encourage students to vote can be really difficult. And this is not just a symptom of second level, but third level as well. And primarily we think this is because of high levels of intense burnout, and that physical and mental well-being is being affected. So we're seeing the after effects of the pandemic. We're seeing that students' union officers are facing intense levels of burnout. We're seeing that students themselves are facing burnout, screen fatigue, all of these other things that are a symptom of the pandemic. Students no longer, you know, they don't want to be attending rallies, things like that. They want to be out socializing. because they've missed what essentially is 3 years of their lives, 3 years with their friends, and their own social skills have been affected because of that. And I suppose this is one of the most one of the biggest negatives that have come out of this, is that I suppose as unions, we're trying to figure out how can we re-engage students with our movements, how can we ensure that the student movement doesn't die, is essentially what we're trying to stop. So I suppose, how do we move forward now? I was listening to a podcast the other day, the group chat by Gavin Riley, Richard Chambers, and Zara King, and there was a really good quote on it. I think it was Katrina O'Connor that was quoted, but during the pandemic we had to separate communities, and now we must figure out how to bring them together. I think this is really important for the student movement going forward. It's not about mobilizing students anymore. It's about bringing them together as a community and ensuring that they feel valued as part of the movement, because at the moment they don't feel listened to, and we need to ensure that we're not only fighting to get stakeholders listen to students, but we have to ensure that the unions themselves are listening to each individual student at the grassroots. It is about building that community, and we need to go back to our grassroots to ensure that there are mechanisms for individual students to speak to their officers, that there are mechanisms for students to, I suppose, make that individual change. Does a young person have to be a member of their union if they want to make an impact in their community? Absolutely not. And we need to ensure that students are aware of this as well, because ultimately, again, it's about being a member of this community. It's not just a students' union, it is a community, essentially. And I think that's just really important going forward. Again, there's a great quote, and there's no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. If we can get a community of students together to kind of discover what are the most important issues. Is it leaving cert reform? Is it third level access? Is it the reform of the CAO? Is it accommodation at higher education as well? What are the big issues that we need to be talking about, and how can we as a community really make a change and make an impact in that? So yeah, that's essentially it. So I suppose what we're really focusing on is how we can bring students back to the movement, how we can re-engage them. And I think Roisin and Rhiannon really covered some really great points in their own presentations as well. So the ISSU is primarily a second level, so thank you so much for listening. And you can stay in touch with us at ISSU for you on social media, and issu.ie is our website as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Emer, for your keynote. That was actually really enlightening, and I just want to applaud the value of the work of you and that of ISSU, simply because it's great to have a second level student voice. I think sometimes when we're talking about student engagement, a lot of us are part of the tertiary level education system, so we kind of often forget about the second level. And I personally think it's just so beneficial in a way of working from the second level. It works at the root at which student engagement is established from the beginning, and furthermore how student engagement can be nurtured within our tertiary level. So that's great, and it was great for you to mention the positives and perhaps the silver lining that the pandemic brought us, which was the student engagement and the elevated student engagement, and then also obviously the subsequent burnout and fatigue and after effects of the pandemic as well. Next, we will have Phil Carey, who will speak on the course representation. Is it fit for purpose, and whose purpose is it for? So delivering a thought-provoking piece, I'm sure. Phil Carey is the Dean of the Teaching and Learning Academy in Liverpool, John Moores University. The Academy's role is to support the enhancement of academic practices across the university. Phil's research interests focus a lot actually around student engagement. So these formed the basis of his appointment as the reader in student engagement in 2016. Phil is also a UK National Teaching Fellow. So please take it away, Phil.
It's very rare for me to be on mute. So thanks very much, everyone. I really am very grateful that you invited me along today. I kind of wish I was there in person because you've probably worked out that being in the UK is a bit like being in a madhouse at the moment. So I'd much prefer to be over with you all in Ireland. But I am very grateful that you've invited me to speak today. And I'm going to talk about course representation. And as Diana said, my background really is in student engagement. And one of the things I think when you read the student engagement literature is some of it does present student engagement a bit like motherhood and apple pie, an intrinsically good thing. And I'm not saying for 1 minute that student engagement isn't a good thing. Of course, it is a good thing. But I think as practitioners and as students and as teachers, we need to allow ourselves to problematize student engagement, to allow ourselves to see it in the round. And I think if we do that, we will get a better engagement system. So I'm going to look particularly at course representation here, but what I really want to stress in this is that a course representation system has to sit in a culture. One of the previous speakers did speak about culture before, and it has to sit in a culture of authentic engagement that operates at all levels of the institution, because without that, it will never achieve what we would want it to achieve. So if I can just move on to my next slide here. So I wanted just to remind us of the different ways we can access the student voice. And actually, most of these have been covered in previous talks. So it's quite nice, I suppose, that I got to sort of cap all this off. There's a strong emphasis on ad hoc and informal mechanisms. And I think it was a colleague, Ashleen, I think from DCU, who referred to these. And I was really pleased to see that referred to, because I think what often happens in an era of quality assurance is we ignore the ad hoc and the informal because they're not documented. But my view as a practitioner of rather too many years standing is that I've learned more about practice and the student experience from just general day-to-day interactions with students. But of course, they only work if that is engaged with in an authentic and compassionate manner, to go to the point that was made before. Of course, as institutions, we also generate shed loads of institutional data about our students so we can understand the student experience without even talking to students, though I realize it's not really about engagement, is it? But I think it's important that we do look at that data, and we do use that data to inform discussions and to help us really understand the experience of 100% of students, because the reality is that when you move away from that institutional data, you will inevitably get less and less students being involved in those sorts of things. And we can do lots to increase the engagement of students. But at the end of the day, all students will engage in terms of performance progression, retention, and completion data. Loads of opportunities for surveys and evaluations. I'm not a massive fan of surveys in many ways, because I think they can suppress discussion rather than encourage discussion. But I also recognize that they are very democratic. So over in the UK, we have something called the National Student Survey for our final year students, and we get about 70% of our students responding to that. That is a really important data set. And I think there is a danger if we overlook that. There's lots of ways we can explore in a discursive manner with our students. And I'm not talking here about formalized committees. I'll talk about them a bit later on, but about those opportunities for semi-formal discussions in class through in-class discussions, or what we call over in the UK town hall events, where we get groups of students together and just have a chat, really. But all importantly, I think, have a lot of students and few academic staff, as opposed to what happens in committees, which is usually a lot of academic staff and relatively few students. So those can be really rich environments where students can talk. Of course, we have course representation. I'll come to that more in a minute. In addition to course representation, I think this is something that academics often fail to distinguish between the notion of a course representative, i.e. a student who has been elected or selected to represent their peers, and a notion of an expert student or a consultant, which is a student who we are engaging with as an individual, and we're attempting to understand the experience of them as an individual without an expectation that they will represent every other student in the institution. Of course, follows well from Emer's presentation before, We do have, in most universities, very active students' unions. I am a firm believer that the relationship between a students' union and the university should not be too cozy. It needs to be a little bit itchy, so the students' union can hold us to account. And I fear sometimes, I think it was a point raised in one of the earlier discussions, I do fear sometimes that students' unions might be co-opted into quality assurance mechanisms, and we need to allow them to have a voice and to be political. That was a point that was raised before. And then finally, and I think this links to the points that were made from our CSI, is those partnership working and co-production models. So opportunities through often project working with students to ensure that the student's voice is represented in lots of ways. And I think the reason why I'm presenting all of this is I see engagement happening when we triangulate this information, where we understand this information in the round. We don't select and privilege one type of information, but we allow it to come together. But of course, my role here is to talk about course representation. And for those of you a bit more sophisticated than me, you might recognize that this is Bologna. I've never been to Bologna. I had to Google it, and I hope this is Bologna. If not, Google's lying to me. And the reason why I put Bologna up is that when I started doing research on course representation, the first thing I learned about course representation is that as long as universities have existed, at least in the modern era, so back to the 13th century, course representatives were part of institutional governance processes. In fact, course representatives were hugely powerful individuals in those processes, and they had to, at some extent, the power to hire and fire staff, to give staff tenure within the institution. Now, clearly, those representatives would be representatives of students in a very elitist model of higher education, and it perhaps doesn't necessarily translate to a mass model of higher education like we have today. But I think it's of interest that the idea of a student representing their peers has been part of the fabric of a university culture literally since universities began over 800 years ago. It's always been there. So it came as a surprise to me as an academic when I started doing some research in this area, that when I looked for literature on student representation, I found very little literature. I found 2 UK studies on course representation. And, excuse me, I think that aligned with probably about 6 across the world. This was about a decade ago. So it's really remarkable, isn't it, that nearly a millennium of work where students have been involved in university decision-making, and no one really thought that much to try and understand that. So I did my own research, and I'm going to tell you a bit about this research. I talked to students about why they became course representatives and what they got from being a course representative. And their motivation was often to prompt action on a particular issue, something that had frustrated them. Their motivation was to help their peers. There was a strong communitarian sense in this. Their motivation was to meet people, often to enhance their CV and to develop their skills. So that's what students will get from course representative systems. What they don't tend to get in institutions is they don't tend to get paid. They don't even tend to get expenses. And in an era where students are time poor and cash poor, certainly in the United Kingdom, where we made the rather bizarre decision to charge them over £9,000 a year for their fees, it seems odd to me that we require student representatives. We need them as part of our governance structures, but we expect them to do it in many ways with that longer term good. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily I'm advocating paying for them, but I think there's an interesting dilemma there straight away, where what would we do if every student said, look, I'm not going to bother being a course representative, I haven't got the time, I haven't got the energy? We would suffer, whereas they might have perhaps a bit more time on their hands. So I thought that was a point worth reflecting on. And then what do they do? Well, here's an interesting thing. The official idea of a course representative is they act as a voice for their fellow students. They gather the feedback from their students, they listen to their students, and then they feed that back into academic decision-making. That's their official role. But what I found was that often they were called on to be a consultant. I've done this myself. practically stop them in the corridor and say, can you tell me about your views of this? Don't necessarily give them any warning, don't necessarily provide an opportunity for them to certainly to engage with their peers to find out what they're doing. And really, I suppose, in some ways, in a dangerous way, hold them to account for decision making when we haven't given them the mechanisms and the opportunities to check out whether their individual view is a view shared by their peers. Often student representatives will mediate between students and staff, and sometimes, I came across examples where students were asked to encourage students to turn up to class on time, to encourage students to just turn up to class, encourage students not to talk in class. I mean, I did end up wondering what we were paying academics for when it appeared in some instances we could get course representatives to do it. Representatives would often provide help and support for their fellow students and be a source of course information, being relied upon, if you like, to maintain things like WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups or whatever social media they use to go, oh, by the way, everyone, there's an assignment deadline tomorrow. So in many ways, I suppose, a quasi-academic in this space, but also they saw themselves in many ways as I would identify them as connective tissue that held the students together. They'd organize social events, they'd get students to engage with each other. So really, the official notion of a course representative was just the tip of an iceberg with loads and loads of activity going on. But what happens is most of that activity from our point of view happens in the committee. Now, I'm not a big fan of committees. I'm paid a reasonable amount of money to get bored in committees, and I do get bored in committees. And now they're all online. I can do my emails, I can play on my phone, I can do all sorts of things in committees, but I really don't enjoy them. And I also, years ago, used to work in public health in England. And I'd go to meetings where members of the public would come to the meeting and they'd sit in a committee and you just watch the life force drain out of them. So my preference is not to sit in committees. But I think it's really important when we look at representatives, if we have a representative system that is based around a committee structure, then we have to understand what it is the committee structure is doing to that representative system. And as I say, certainly in the UK, and I imagine it's the same over in Ireland, most representation, where it's formalized at least, is through something. It might not be officially called a committee, but it will look, it will feel, and it will smell exactly like a committee. So the committees are where student views are received, and the committees are where information is relayed back to the students. And I would argue that committees themselves can discourage dialogue, and they do this by reinforcing inequalities between students and staff. And they do that because they generally overlook the power dynamics. Most of the committees I've sat in have been heavy with staff and light with students, a ratio of perhaps 2 or 3 to 1, and haven't always understood that the students whose work is being marked by the academic staff, whose future, if you like, is in the hands of the academic staff, are being called upon in a direct messaging system to explain what may be going wrong with those courses. So a very naive model. I personally wouldn't do it. If my vice chancellor said, Phil, let's sit in a meeting and you can tell me what I'm doing wrong, I'd say, oh, no, you're doing everything brilliantly, thank you. I've got a mortgage to pay. And this is why I think committees are problematic. They are ritualized spaces. They are heavily ritualized. We've all sat in meetings where we've spent ages talking about the minutes of the last meeting, the action point control register and all of that. And they define what behavior is. And I'm not saying that students should be able to go into meetings and act in an unpleasant or an overly disruptive manner, but that notion of sitting still, being quiet, waiting to be called in, waiting to be given the opportunity to talk, all of those are very ritualized behaviors that exist in a particular committee space that probably doesn't replicate anything else the student will have engaged with in their lives. As a result, I would argue that they discourage dialogue, they discourage engagement, they suppress commentary. And they will also alienate those who have little familiarity with the process. So when I spoke to students, they talk about their confusion. They weren't quite sure what was going on. You know, even some of the language that was used, like the chair, you know, wait for the chair to speak. I mean, if you think about that, that sounds really rather bizarre. But so all of these sorts of mechanisms actually shut them up. And as a result of that, it limited the creativity and the flexibility that was needed to help us understand the student voice. Because the reality is, if I set an agenda for the meeting, that meeting is going to reflect me. It's not going to necessarily open up what the students actually want to talk about. So even that action of setting an agenda, I think, can really limit the dialogue that happens in the group. And as a result of that, members, and particularly those who are lower status, and sadly students in organisations are often lower status, are relegated to the role of a spectator. And we will have all sat in meetings where someone hasn't spoken and then come out of that meeting and the person is chatty as hell. And that's because I would argue the theatre of the committee actually has suppressed that voice. And then thinking about this in a slightly more theoretical sense, this all aligns with the notion of what is a good student. So when I look at the notion of a good student, what I've seen is the idea of a good student now isn't just about their grades, it's about their behaviour, and that behaviour has extended beyond performance to notions of engagement. So now a good student is an engaged student. Now, believe me, I love engaged students, but I don't necessarily recognise why my view of what is a good student should align with that. So therefore, what about the student who is angry? What about the student who is frustrated? What about the student who is political? What about the student who wants to break the system a little bit? How do they work in this ritualized space? And I've got a quote here from, I'm not sure how to pronounce the first name, Mama Shayla, I don't know how, Lucia Mama Shayla. A great paper if you get a chance to read it. They're based in South Africa. Interesting, lots of literature in around student engagement has come from South Africa. And they talk about how the co-optation of students into committees moderates activist students. So in other words, it shapes what they want to say and forces it into a narrative that actually benefits the institution. In many ways, the student reflects back to the institution what the institution wants to hear. So the disruptive student, the angry student, the frustrated student either doesn't go to those committees, keeps their gob shut in those committees because it's a frightening place to speak out, or speaks out in the committees and then is transformed into a bad student and probably alienated from those committees in the first place. So it all fits in with a narrative then that suggests if you really want to deactivate activists, the best way to do them is to knit them into the system. And again, when I did my own research, and this isn't a criticism at all of those students, sometimes students would say to me things like, the problem I realized was that students just didn't understand, because I saw what the world of the academic was like. And I think this links into a point one of the speakers made before. I saw what the world of the academic was like. And therefore, when my fellow students complained about that, I recognized that they didn't see it from the same perspective. Now, that's all well and good. But the reality is I work at an institution where we might have 600 student representatives, and we've got 27,000 students. So not all of them will have that opportunity unless we provide it in other ways. And that plays back to the point I made right at the beginning, that representation will only work if we have it in an authentic sense, where we have real conversations with students and where we engage with them, where we let them into our world, perhaps not too much. They don't want to know the drama of marking and assessment, for example. They've got enough of that to deal with in their own way. But we present that in lots of different ways. So the institution becomes a talking institution. So when representatives talk, and there is a role for representatives, when representatives talk, everyone understands that's just the nature of the culture of the organization and the nature of dialogue. So as an alternative, one of the things that we've done in John Moores, and it was an experiment which unfortunately didn't get followed through, but probably because it challenged some of the expectations, is we basically, through a student engagement panel, across university student engagement panel, said we're not going to run it as a committee. We fought with the institution to get rid of the rituals of the committee. We limited the agenda to a very small number of ideas that came from the student body that offered a focus for discussion but weren't rigid. We used a workshop format to encourage debate, often with academics sitting outside those discussions, but not always, because it was important to have a dialogue here, sitting outside those, sometimes to let the students talk and then engaging in that debate. We ran our meetings early in the evening because we recognized that if we're going to expect students to attend class, we can't put meetings in when they're in class. We catered for those meetings, recognizing that students by 4 or 5 o'clock might be a bit hungry. And we also provided expenses so that students could turn up to those meetings. And then finally, and I think this was the thing that the university struggled most with, we didn't minute the meetings. That was a joy to me because I hate minutes, but we provided a report. We offered, each meeting came up almost, if you like, with a story of that meeting, what happened in that meeting, what ideas were expressed in that meeting. So it all looked a lot less formal. What we found was that students attended more. Our student engagement panel went from relatively limited attendance and quite often not a lot of re-attendance because they were voting with their feet, to people turning up again and again. So we increased that attendance quite a lot. We also saw for the first time engagement from our postgraduate research community and our postgraduate talk community, as well as undergraduates. Most of our active representatives were in the undergraduate space, but this process extended that out to the postgraduate space. Conversations were richer, they were more meaningful. Students provided constructive challenge because they were able to do that. And sometimes they were able to do that in a safe space rather than because it was in a small group workshop and then it would be fed back. So it was slightly neutralized. And, you know, we received some quite challenging, but importantly challenging feedback. As a result of that, we as an institution gained greater insight. And I've just put some quotes here. I'm not going to read you through the quotes because you'd probably lose the will to live if I do that. But this is from some feedback. And if you read that, what was interesting about the feedback is that it encouraged a sense of connection. But also it was a bit of a surprise because they fully expected it to be tick boxing. So when I read this feedback, I think, they expected that we were going to do some disingenuous process that would limit them. And actually they were quite surprised when they engaged in a process that, I wouldn't say liberated them, I'm not going to say it was that important, but allowed them to speak. So apologies if I've spoken quickly. I am a naturally caffeinated human being, and I've just had a coffee, so I'm a very caffeinated human being. But I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop sharing now, but I know that we've got some questions for myself and Amir now, I think.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Phil. That was actually a really striking view of kind of the institutional system, and you touched base on so many unique and different topics about student voices, and actually you kind of gave us a history lesson about the evolutionary role of representatives, so that was great. One particular point that kind of stood out to me was the importance that you brought to the tiers of the institution, such as committees and stuff like that, and the values and benefits of, say, incorporating the different forms of student engagement. And you showed evident with kind of support of how helpful they are to the students, rather than kind of taking it as a selective approach as to just kind of using committees per se. Another thing was that you kind of refocused the why, and that was a really great thing. I thought it was kind of showing the intrinsic motivations that students already have, and oftentimes we forget because we're just talking about we need student engagement, but we forget the why and the intrinsic motivations and why they would do it, and that's to promote action, to help peers, to enhance their skills, and also contrary the interesting perspective of the existing extrinsic motivation that are there for students per se. So relevantly, I think similar to the features of the committee that you brought about and the limitations it has, I think Sharon shared something. She asked, does it mean that the only privileged students can be course representatives, the ones who don't have caring responsibilities and part-time jobs? And I think you kind of touched base on that. What about the students who kind of are considered not as good students? So what are what about the other students who may not necessarily be able to, represent or be part of, contribute to representation? What's your take on that, Phil?
I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I do worry that we have systems that inevitably facilitate opportunities for people who have time for them. Interestingly, I mean, the university, I don't know if any of you know Liverpool, we're not a rich city, and John Moore University is not the posh university in a poor city. So I've worked historically with lots of students who have an awful lot of demands on their time for predominantly caring commitments or work commitments. Interestingly, they are some of the most engaged students I've ever worked with. So I don't think it necessarily follows through, but I recognize that that's fudging the issue a bit. I think we as institutions could leverage many more opportunities for students to benefit from that. I do think we should look at paying student representatives, certainly things like expenses. I mean, why we wouldn't pay a bus fare for somebody to get into university to go to a meeting is just beyond me. But I think we should manage that. I personally would like to look at bursaries and stuff like that, or honorariums, or just a small amount of payment that might make life a little bit easier. But then I think we could link representation much more closely into our accreditation systems. We will send, as an institution, we send all of our students out to do work placements. If you're a representative, that's a fantastic work placement opportunity. So there's an opportunity, I suppose, to credentialize it. So through either micro-accreditation that will ultimately help students getting jobs, or through actually linking into assessment strategies. So I think we could use many more creative ways to support students. Unfortunately, there will always be students who just don't have the time, and that is, certainly over here, where our students are just full of debt and have all of those, which I don't know what the situation is in Ireland, but I'm still very angry about the introduction of student fees. So I could really get on my soapbox and not shut up about that for a while, but I will. But I think those are things that, as a result of that, I do think there is a risk that this will privilege the already privileged. But we need to find ways to work around that. I'm fudging it now, so I'll stop.
Yeah, for sure, Philip. And I think this goes on not just present in the tertiary level, but I'm sure for Emer as well, she can speak on that perhaps a little bit on kind of the second level students, and how, sometimes they can find it hard to contribute to representation and engagement as well. Emer, do you have any points that you'd like to share, perhaps?
Diana, I think we've lost Emer due to internet troubles, so we'll try to get her back.
No worries. Okay, so we have a few more questions for you, Philip. So we have Ashling that said, you mentioned triangulation earlier between different sources of representation and student input. I'm very interested in how both students and staff can leverage different sources of information about student experience. Did NSS or other survey feedback inform perhaps panel discussions, or are there any thoughts on students having access to student feedback data and how students can be supported to use this information? I think that's a great question. What's your take?
Yeah, I think it is a great question. I mean, I would say, in terms, you mentioned the NSS, I think probably in certainly the English higher education system, because Scottish universities don't need to do the NSS, Welsh and English do. I think we've slightly overrated the NSS pudding, to be honest. I'll put that to one side, because everyone knows about that. But I think the important thing is that we provide that information and we allow, and I think the nub of the question was around getting students to work with that data. I'm less interested in some ways in them working with that data than them seeing that data, recognizing that data, and then seeing action on that data. I hate the notion of closing the feedback loop, because it sounds like stopping a conversation. But I do think it's really important that we find a way, and I think that goes back to that culture piece, that students recognize this was the feedback they gave, and this is what happened as a result of that. So and all of this information should be public, it should be available, it shouldn't be hidden behind firewalls and all that. And I think that's really important, so that students get a sense of that. And the good thing is, when you give students data, we did some great work. We have an evaluation system, module evaluation system that works through a system called Explorance, which links into our virtual learning environment. And we did some great work with students where we got students to design the questions. And the questions they were coming up with weren't ones that I'd have thought of, because I see teaching from a teacher's point of view. I don't see it from a student's point of view. I can't. I can be empathic, I can be sympathetic, but I'm never actually going to experience that. And the way they framed questions was much different. And some of the language was very different. So I think getting students involved in all of those stages of data collection and understanding is useful. And again, let's think about this creatively. Why don't we get students to use that in projects so they can get academic credit from analysing data? Everyone benefits. So I think there's many more creative ways we could do that, but definitely the more data we have, the more data we use, the better.
Yes, brilliant. Megan, that's right. I hate the idea of closing the feedback loop because it makes it seem like we're ending the conversation. Put that on the t-shirt. That was really great. Thank you. Phil, quote from Phil 2022, really, really insightful. Again, Celine mentions, would welcome your views and others on how students are selected for university-wide committees as student representatives over and above course committees. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I mean, I realize I'm talking a lot, so someone would have to shut me up, really. I do talk a lot, so there we go. In my research, I would say probably the main way that students became student reps was through offering themselves as student reps, and occasionally they were elected. More often than not, they were the only person who put themselves up, so they were chosen, and then sometimes they were selected. So sometimes academic staff would say, you should be a student rep. But in our system, we're very permissive. So we allow more than a certain, we don't have a limit on the number of student reps. As I said, we have about 600 across the institution now. So some programs can have 4 or 5 in a level of study. And we also allow students to become student reps at different points in their careers. But to be honest, election of representatives was the least likely. And I struggle with a model sometimes that says we're going to go in the first year. I remember back to my first year, which was a long time ago, when I've got Alzheimer's, I can still remember it. And I can remember if someone had said to me, would you want to be a representative? I'd have rather cut my head off. I'd have died with the thought of that. It would have been horrendous. A few months later, I was much more confident. So I think we say to our, sometimes 18-year-old kids, no offense, they're fresh in the institution, they're fresh in the city, and we say to them, would you like to be a representative? And then one puts their hand up and then they become the representative. Leave it for 3 months, you might get a much wider group of people. They will also know each other. If you have an election, they might know each other. So I think some of those, we need the representatives, so we won't actually think about what is the best for the person who's going to be the representative. We're just going to go down the route of we need a representative. But I'm aware that other people haven't had a chance to say a word, so I don't know whether anyone else has a comment in relation to that.
Yeah, definitely, if anyone wants to add to the conversation, definitely feel free. I think for me as a student, just kind of hearing what the points that you've mentioned, Philip, particularly with not closing the feedback loop. I think there's one strategy, the name's kind of gone over my head, so I don't really remember the name, but it's essentially kind of having a report again of records of what students contributed and what are some of the points and issues that they raised. And it's like what you said, what we did. And it was a report that just kind of was given back to the students, just so that they were more aware of kind of what are the changes that have been going on with respect to the points that they made. And I thought that was actually present in our college. And I thought that was really, really helpful. It wasn't just necessarily, didn't feel like, oh, I just went to a meeting, I told them how I felt and I felt listened to, and that was the end of that. Towards the end, there was a lot of reciprocity in terms of communication and engagement from both parties. So it kind of felt more continuous. And I think in the longer term of things, students that were under in the years below us would be able to view those reports and could see what were the progressive changes. And evidently the evolution of how, the value of representatives kind of took part in. So yes, I thought that
one
was
of the problems with any of those sorts of, I mean, I Megan, I think it was you said we did. I Googled you said we did once. And I think the first 2 pages of Google's were university websites. So it's what we do. We got it wrong once. In John Moore's, we put you said, we said, which just made it sound like we were having an argument, but that's a story for another day. But one of the problems with it is that students, by virtue of what they are with the institution for a very short period of time. So acting on feedback, you can't say to students, well, other students told me a while ago about this, but I think that's where we need a culture where students recognize that their feedback will be acted on. I think part of it, Diana, does come from some of that, and I think it has a symbolic value. That's all it has, really. It doesn't have much more than that. But then students need to feel that if I say this, it will happen. And someone had put in the chat a minute ago, I noticed about the importance of saying to students, this is why we're not responding to your feedback. These are intelligent people. If you say to them, we can't do it for this reason, they will get it. They're not stupid, and we've had students asking for ridiculous things and we've said no. We've had students asking for really sensible things. I mean, I got into my role because I was angry that our students were told if they wanted fresh water, they could either buy a bottle from the canteen or that the water in the bathrooms was potable, was drinkable. And I just thought that was outrageous. And then that's why I started going to the student engagement panels to see how students were engaging with that. It took us 10 years to get a bloody water cooler. And that I couldn't defend that. I can't sit with a group of students and say, look, this is the way it goes. But I can sit with them and say, you know what, it's academic credit. You're not going to get it for free. You know what, you have to do your assessments. All of that when they, and I think those are adult conversations. And I don't want to patronize students. I don't want to infantilize them, but I often find myself on their side sort of shaking my head in disbelief that I appear to work for a university that sometimes moves with the speeds of a very calcined snail. And I think probably we're all a bit like that, aren't we? So that's not just John Moore's.
Yeah. I see some comments in the chat saying that, the use of language is really important with, you said we did instead of maybe we said we did. So it kind of shows more collectivism and stuff like that. Yvonne mentioned a really good point. It's also customer service talk rather than partnership. So that's definitely a good way to kind of put it in a certain sense.
Yeah. I see someone else has picked up on usual suspects as well. That's another one of my pet hates. Usual suspects make them sound like murderers. They're just people who want something and they're willing to speak about it. But anyway, there's always a high horse danger, and I'm going to get on it and cant around the dining room in a minute. So you better move me on, Diana.
Of course, I think we're all kind of in agreement. If we have any further comments or feedback regarding these topics, again, feel free, and I encourage you all to encourage with the keynote speakers via the chat box again, or with the speakers' contacts. Nonetheless, I do hope you all enjoyed this segment this evening. Now I'm going to hand you back to Megan for closing.